Sebastian Kurz declares victory in Austria's national election, which reveals a swing to the right. So where will the so-called Wonder Kid take Austria? What does his rise mean for Europe? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Now, the results from Austria's national election are in, and it looks like Sebastian Kurz is poised to become the world's youngest head of government. Kurz declared victory after his Conservative People's Party won more than 31% of the vote. It wasn't enough for a simple majority, so it means he'll need to form a coalition government. That marriage is expected to be a union between his party and the second-place far-right Freedom Party. Now, during the campaign, Kurz adopted a tough stance against refugees and immigration. In his victory speech, Kurz talked about his mandate.
I have a big request for you. Use today to celebrate. You all have earned it through hard work and dedication. At the same time, I need to tell you that tomorrow the work starts. We did not just run to win the elections, we did so to bring Austria back to the top. We ran in this election to achieve real change.
As we mentioned earlier, Kurz will need to form that coalition, but those talks could prove difficult for the Wonder Kid. The head of the far-right Freedom Party accused Kurz of co-opting his message during the campaign.
Now we will see if they really mean it honestly or seriously, if they are even willing to have honest negotiations with us or not. And I'm telling you, you can rely on one thing. We are going to stay true to ourselves. Dear friends, we are going to stay true to the Austrian people.
Well, let's bring our guests into the show. We have in Lancaster in the United Kingdom, Allyson Fiddler, Professor of German and Austrian Studies. She's also the author of an upcoming book, The Art of Resisting Cultural Protest Against the Austrian Far Right. And on Skype from London, Matthew Goodwin, Senior Visiting Fellow at Chatham House's Europe Programme. Good to have you with us. Let's start with Allyson then. How did a country which was one of the most welcoming to refugees a couple of years ago veer so much to the right so quickly?
Well, whether it's been quite so quick is of course debatable. It's true, of course, Austria did welcome in large numbers of refugees, about the third, I think, placed in Europe in terms of per capita, the number of refugees coming through, and you know have been, I think, very welcoming towards asylum seekers. I think this isn't something that has just happened. However, there is an undercurrent. You can look back to, I'm sure we'll be talking about this more, but back to the millennial elections, 1999-2000, when Jörg Haider's Freedom Party came into coalition with the Austrian People's Government. And back then too, there was a lot of mileage made of, if you like, anti-immigrant rhetoric.
Well, things have changed a bit since then, haven't they, Matthew? According to the Austrian government's 2017 integration report, which I read up, immigration to Austria dropped dramatically last year with a fall in asylum applications of more than 50%. Why was there so much focus during the election campaign then on immigration?
Well, I think the main concern among Austrians really followed the eruption of the refugee crisis in 2015, and we saw a very concerted attempt by the centre-right leader Sebastian Kurz to effectively target far-right voters by talking very tough on that refugee issue. If you just think about some of the policies that Kurz had advocated.
But hang on, Matthew, he's appealed apparently to more than just the far-right voters, right? It looks like he's captured people who may not have previously aligned themselves with the far-right.
Well, he's held up the centre-right vote, the Austrian People's Party vote. He will also have attracted some non-voters, but Austria instinctively is quite a conservative country. We know that Austrians considered the European Union's handling of the refugee crisis to be one of its greatest failures, which we discovered in a survey at Chatham House. But Kurz, for example, talked of slashing benefits for migrants. He moved the army onto the southern border to patrol the borders with police. He talked about closing Islamic schools for children. Kurz and his party oversaw a ban on the burqa, meaning that anybody can be fined for wearing Islamic face covering clothing in public. And all of this was part of an attempt to really occupy that radical right space. So I think Kurz came into this election with a very clear strategy, and clearly it's paid off.
He has come in with a very clear strategy. In a sense, Allyson, has he stolen some of the ground from the from the Freedom Party?
Absolutely, and of course he's been rebuked for so doing by the leader of the Freedom Party, Heinz-Christian Strache, whose campaign posters call him the Vordenker, the man who thought about these things beforehand. So Strache has quite openly accused Kurz of having taken some of his policies on. Of course, I suppose, if we get a coalition between these two parties, then to some extent Kurz will have done Strache's work for him, but it doesn't look like that. And I think Strache's feeling a bit aggrieved that their political, if you like, their campaigning points have been taken from them and championed by one of the established parties.
However bitter the Freedom Party may be about what the People's Party leader has been saying and doing, Matthew would agree that there's no going back. This is a country that has shifted towards the right, even if by some miracle they work out a coalition with the Social Democrats rather than the Freedom Party.
Look, Austria, like many other European states, has moved decisively to the right. That's without question. There are some outliers. Macron in France, but of course in the first round we saw over 40% vote for anti-EU candidates. Jeremy Corbyn in Britain perhaps has done better than some expected, but the general story in Europe, as reflected in Austria, is of a continent that is moving to the right. And crucially, let's not lose sight of one important development. Really for the first time in years, the centre-left in Austria has appeared to at least agree to discuss with the radical right Freedom Party the possibility of forming an alliance. And it's unlikely to happen, but simply crossing that line to even discuss that possibility with the radical right, I think, is an important moment in post-war European politics.
It's something definitely to be looked at in terms of where the continent is going, as well as Austria. Allyson, when we try and look ahead, it's important to remember, of course, Kurz has been in power. He's held positions as the foreign minister, minister of integration. Austria does have an integration law, which for the first time included legal standards for what constitutes integration, and a legally binding integration declaration, which applicants had to sign, and so on. What sort of impact has that had on the whole integration and immigration situation in Austria?
I don't know about these new laws, but if you look at citizenship tests in Austria, they've been quite clear about what they wish from people becoming Austrian, whether they're from the Middle East or elsewhere. But as has been referred to, it's sort of coming at a time when, with the full facial veil ban, it's not just the burqa, they're clamping down on anybody with fancy dress costumes on that mask their face. It's part of a general, if you like, package of things that are looking to be more anti-foreigners. Yes, we'll see, who ends up being in the coalition. As Matthew's just pointed out, it's unlikely that the Social Democrats will do so, and the unthinkable has happened, that they haven't ruled it out. In 1999-2000, the Austrian People's Party, so Kurz's party, ruled out a coalition with the Freedom Party, but it then reneged on that and did actually form a coalition. So
So if we break it down,
it's
Allyson, I
new
mean,
to hear the Social
break it down for
Democrats.
viewers. What does that mean in terms of the sort of direction or policies we can expect from Austria going forward, Allyson? Are we going to see an Austria that's more insular, closed, less enthusiastic about the EU? You know, what does it ultimately mean?
Well, of course, Austria takes on the EU presidency in the second half of 2018, so it'll get fairly critical then. Last year, when we had a protracted attempt to elect an Austrian president, we saw a kind of rallying of, if you like, really pro-EU sentiment, in that the winner of that contest, closely fought though it was, Alexander van der Bellen, campaigned on a platform of looking after Austria's reputation. And that came really as a reaction to what was going on in Britain with Brexit, because Austria could see that coming out of the EU wasn't a great idea. Whether that's going to change remains to be seen. Last year, Hofer, that's the ally of Kurz, of Strache's in the Freedom Party, his a right-hand man, he had initially said that he'd made anti-EU noises, but then said that the people must decide, so that it would go to a referendum. Maybe that's the way things will go. Perhaps they will have a referendum in Austria too.
Perhaps they will.
Remains to be seen.
Let's look at things from the outside in as well. Matthew, how do you think those Euro diplomats in Brussels are going to be watching and viewing what's happened in Vienna?
I suspect that they'll take this as further evidence of the strength of populism in Austria. I think they'll look at the Freedom Party's vote, with the party attracting more than 1 in 4 voters as being in the same kind of challenge to the European Union project as Marine Le Pen in France and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. But I think they'll also view this perhaps as likely to turn up the volume on that opposition to how the EU has managed the refugee crisis. I suspect Hungary and Poland and other states in Central and Eastern Europe will probably be celebrating the result because of Kurz's position on the refugee issue. I think they'll be feeling as though they've got one more person in their corner trying to push back against how the EU has managed that crisis, trying to toughen up the external border, stop the NGOs from patrolling the Med, coming up with a more conservative response, if you like, on that issue. So I think the EU will be alarmed. What we won't see, however, is an imposition of those diplomatic sanctions that we saw in 2000, when the European Union really, I think, in the eyes of many, actually overreacted in its response to the Freedom Party joining a coalition then. And commissioned a report to ensure that human rights were being upheld. I don't think we'll see anything like that this time around, which again shows us how far Europe has travelled.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, Matthew. Allyson, the Freedom Party, as both of you now mentioned, you know, they have been in a coalition government before, in the early 2000s. Why is there a feeling this time that the country is really on the verge of this is different?
Well, I mean, firstly, to go back to the issue of, you know, whether there will be international consternation, Matthew's obviously right on this, that it's unthinkable, I think, that the EU will now muscle in and start to slap down Austria, possibly in part because in so many of the member states there are equivalent successes for the far right. So everybody's busy looking at their own, getting their own house in order or not. So I think it's unlikely that you know, Austria will be deemed to be, you know, have to be brought back into line. What's changed? You know, obviously we've got the effects of the refugee crisis. It's odd. I don't know what else has changed. If you asked, I mean, there have been polls suggesting that you know, 45% of Austrians think that they're less well off economically and they need somebody to sort this out. So the economic agenda, lower taxes, this is of course another promise of Kurz, you know, are also on the menu. It's not just an immigration backlash. I can't really put a finger on, you know, what might have changed in society. What I feel sure will happen, though, perhaps to a lesser extent than it did last time, is that there will be domestic protest. There has already been impromptu protest yesterday on the streets in Vienna. Already there are petitions circulating to try to stop a coalition between the black and the blue, or between the turquoise and the blue, as we must say. Kurz has changed the party colours as well as a few other things.
All right, I'm glad you mentioned the protests. Let's bring into the show at this point, joining us from Vienna, Alexis Neuberg. He's host of Radio Africa TV. Good to have you with us. We're talking about perhaps the backlash within Austria. Do you see much of an attempt to block coalition forming, Alexis?
We think here in Vienna that everything is still being open. It will depend on the negotiation of the building of the government, because it will be not easy. All constellations are complicated. There are some difficulties about the coalition possibilities. When the blue and the black, they make a coalition, they have a very big fight according to the topics, because all of them, they are saying, the blue are saying they steal, the black one, they steal their own topics. They don't have their own topics. This means if they make a coalition with them, they will not be able to bring the topics in the program of the government. So the red one also, they decided in the beginning to say they will not cooperate with people who are disseminating hate against European Union. It is here now open. It is a big suspense because nobody knows what will happen.
There's a big suspense. No one knows what happens. Matthew, you mentioned there the push back from the EU in the early 2000s against the last government when the Freedom Party played a role. We don't expect that. Do we expect any form of pushback from the EU at all?
I think it's unlikely to see a big mobilization against Austria, largely because the EU, to be blunt, has bigger fish to fry. It's a continent that's really still trying to encourage that very fragile economic growth to come through a bit more fully, and also, you know, to try and get to grips with some of those sentiments that we just heard about, that much of Southern Europe in particular is really not feeling much of the economic pickup over the last year and a half. And when you throw in a lingering refugee crisis and the Brexit negotiations, the election in Austria simply isn't going to impose itself on the agenda in the same way that Austrian politics did in earlier years. It may be that actually
also, is one of the reasons, Matthew, though, also the fact that the political landscape in Europe has changed compared to the 2000s. I mean, the early 2000s. I mean, well, the rise of the far right in other places has been a noticeable factor.
Well, I would say also, you know, apart from that swing to the right, I would say what's changed has been a collapse of support for the left. In 2000, 13 of the 15 governments in the EU had centre-left parties in them. This year, currently, only 6 of the 28 governments in the European Union have left-wing parties in them, and most of those are what we would call periphery states like Malta and Portugal. So I think when you look at the general direction of Europe, the centre-left has been struggling, and the centre-right and the populist right, in general terms, have been doing quite well, and Austria confirms that.
Although there are ideological differences, Allyson, is one way of looking at what's been happening across Europe, whether it's, you know, Kurz in Austria, the rise of Macron in France, the Brexit vote. Could we draw a common sort of anti-establishmentism line through all of this?
Yeah, well, it's tempting to do so, but I think it's a bit ironic, really, because certainly in the case of Austria, I mean, this is still establishment. This is the Austrian People's Party, which has formed grand coalitions on and off. It's part of the old system. It's just
that. Well, Allyson Kurz has presented himself. His whole thing is being different from the old boys club. Yeah. Or at least that's how he seems to have sold himself.
Exactly. But is he? We will find out. But, you know, just changing your party colour and dubbing yourself a movement instead of a party isn't really, you know, enough to prove that this is something new. Macron's, En Marche is a new party. This isn't in Austria. It's an old party that's giving itself a makeover. Now you could see this in other countries too, of course, not least in our own. But is he really something new? He's a young a career politician. He's been in politics since he was 24. He's only 31 now, and he's certainly garnered a lot of support for his youth and vitality and energy, and I think actually to some extent too his ability to stay calm in lots of TV duels that have been played out over the last months. Austria's really gone to town on sort of building up a drama, a narrative, a fight, if you like. They've been called duels on the television to sort of make them out to be, if you like, political fights. And Kurz has come across incredibly well in those. So,
interesting, you mentioned...
The other thing, though, about
the duels, if I could bring Alexis into that, because, of course, you work in television too. Are we heading towards an Austria that's more politically polarized, with people dueling over issues?
The general opinion here is that the migrant people or migrants' positions have been the most big issue in all this campaign, and we see that all Austrian, they are moving in the direction migration and foreign policy, and that's the problem that we have here, because here people began to prepare themselves what will happen if the government Blau and Black come on the power. But we are thinking that, personally as a journalist, I'm thinking that it will not be easy, even if the government come on the power between the coalition between Blau and Black. I don't think that they will go on using the same terminology they are using in the campaign.
Final important point for Matthew. When Britain voted for Brexit, a lot of EU leaders were speaking about now we're going to accelerate European integration now that those reluctant Brits are finally out the club. Has any of that changed now, that, given what's happened in Austria, given the rise of the far right in France and Germany too?
Well, I think at the beginning of the year, the election of Macron and then the defeat of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands really gave Europe a renewed sense of confidence, and it doubled down on that narrative of, right, let's get on with integration, let's get on with deepening the European project, if not necessarily widening the European project. But I think over the last month, we've just had two big elections, Germany and Austria, both of which in their own ways have given us clear evidence that there is a section within European society, there is a large number of voters who don't feel as though the current economic settlement and the political settlement are working for them. And I think this is just a reminder for the EU that it can't really just continue as normal and carry on with business as normal. It's going to have to start to think about why around 1 in 4 voters in Austria or 1 in 8 in Germany are voting for parties that are clearly quite populist, anti-immigration and quite hostile to the EU.
Well, it's a lot for them to figure out. Let's wish them well with that one. We're out of time on this show, so it's time to thank our guests, Alexis Neuberg, Allyson Fiddler and Matthew Goodwin. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.